Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal beneath the carefully crafted facade of cutting-edge biomedical research that Professor Hank Dalton presented to the world, a far more sinister agenda simmered beneath the surface, one that was meticulously plotted and weaponized as a trap for those who believed they were in control. To the scientific community and general public, Dalton appeared to be a brilliant, tireless mind devoted to the noble pursuit of human advancement. His work in experimental genetics and neural reprogramming placed him at the forefront of a promising new frontier in medicine. But in reality, every experiment, every grant proposal, and every laboratory prototype was part of a deeply calculated deception. Dalton was no longer just a scientist. He had become the architect of an intricate, dangerous game that lured dark forces into a web of exposure and ultimate destruction. At the center of his trap was Jen Sidwell, a wealthy manipulator who believed his money and influence allowed him to own Dalton's research and direct its outcomes. What Sidwell didn't know was that he had never been the puppet master, he had always been the puppet. Every encrypted file Sidwell thought he had stolen was a decoy. Every live demonstration Dalton presented was layered with falsified data designed to test not only Sidwell's intentions, but also the identity of the shadowy figure Sidwell served. Referred to only as the mutual friend. This supposed benefactor, who remained unnamed in every correspondence and order, exuded a menacing presence that Dalton had long suspected. The tone of Sidwell's threats, the veiled warnings about sending someone to ensure progress, and the vague but brutal consequences of failure all pointed towards someone who was no stranger to psychological warfare, calculated terror, and a thirst for control. Dalton, connecting the pieces with obsessive precision, found himself staring at a name long presumed erased by death, Victor Cassadine. Official reports claimed Victor had perished in Greenland during a violent explosion, his charred remains discovered and confirmed. But to Dalton, the story was too neat, too clean, and too perfectly wrapped. It didn't align with the man he had heard about, a brilliant tactician obsessed with lineage, legacy, and genetic supremacy. Dalton considered the possibility that Victor had staged his own demise using the very scientific tools he had once attempted to exploit, facial reconstruction, DNA fabrication, or even human cloning. As outlandish as these theories might have sounded, nothing was impossible for a Cassadine. Sidwell's abrupt demands, laced with fear and urgency, served only to reinforce Dalton's theory. Victor was not only alive, he was orchestrating a comeback from the shadows. Rather than crumble under the threat of exposure or annihilation, Dalton pivoted into offense. He intentionally delayed the project's progress, feeding Sidwell manipulated progress reports that suggested failure, in order to trigger desperation. Each panicked communication from Sidwell was meticulously documented. Using a hidden network of servers and triple-encrypted channels, Dalton began compiling evidence. Not just of financial fraud, but of an international conspiracy involving biological weapons, data theft, and possibly even illegal human experimentation. His lab, seemingly filled with research samples and microscopes, had become a battlefield for control over the future of genetic science. Dalton's primary mission was no longer academic discovery, it was to unmask Victor Cassadine, expose Sidwell as an accomplice, and destroy the monster hiding in plain sight. At the same time, new puzzle pieces began falling into place. Dalton took particular note when news broke of the return of Liesl Albrecht and Britt Westbourne to Port Charles. Both women shared complicated histories with the Cassadine dynasty, particularly Victor. Their reappearances could not be coincidental, especially when timed alongside Sidwell's sudden move into Windermere, the ancestral Cassadine estate. From there, Sidwell began to subtly exert pressure on Alexis Davis, another individual whose ties to the Cassadine bloodline ran deep. These moves were not random. They were orchestrated power plays, meant to re-establish control over territory, resources, and genetic legacies. Sidwell, though powerful in his own right, was behaving like a middleman, someone obeying orders, navigating instructions from a more dominant force. To Dalton, it was all confirmation that his suspicions were correct. Victor had returned, perhaps physically, perhaps through a surrogate or clone, but undeniably, his influence was spreading once more like a virus. The project that Sidwell had funded, the same research he so desperately demanded results from, was likely never about curing disease or enhancing human life. It was about domination. It was about replicating bloodlines, rewriting histories, and ensuring that the Cassadine legacy could survive even death. And Dalton, the only one who saw the full scope of the plan, was now the last line of defense between scientific progress and a descent into genetic tyranny. Every action Dalton took from that moment forward was laced with dual meaning. Each lab test was cross-contaminated with subtle markers. Each synthetic protein was tagged with a tracking molecule. Unknown to Sidwell, Dalton was engineering a biosignature that could identify any replicated body, any artificially grown clone. Perhaps even Victor himself, should he re-emerge. More than just a whistleblower, Dalton was building a forensic map that could prove what few would dare to believe, that Victor Cassadine had cheated death, manipulated the world, and returned to reclaim what he believed was his birthright. The trap was nearing completion. All that remained was to let Sidwell, and whoever else was watching, believe that Dalton had finally reached a breakthrough worth stealing. That bait would force the hidden hand to reveal itself, even if only for a moment. And in that moment, Dalton planned to strike. Whether with data, exposure, or destruction, he would do whatever it took to sever the Cassadine influence from the future of science. The stakes were no longer academic, they were existential. Dalton's mission had evolved from discovery to survival, from passive observation to strategic retaliation. The world believed he was building a new future for medicine. In truth, he was fighting to save it from the ghosts of the past, ghosts with the power to return in flesh and blood, under a name the world had already buried but never truly escaped, Cassadine. While the world viewed Professor Hank Dalton as a man overwhelmed by scientific failures and mounting pressure from powerful benefactors, the truth was far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous. Behind the carefully orchestrated image of a struggling scientist was a mind operating several steps ahead of his enemies. Dalton wasn't drowning in the chaos. He was the one creating it. Every perceived setback in his project, every delay or unexpected deviation, was part of a meticulously planned strategy designed to confuse, mislead, and ultimately expose the true forces manipulating his research for their own dark purposes. At the core of his plan was a sophisticated internal encryption system, one of Dalton's greatest hidden achievements. This covert framework was built to silently record and safeguard every scrap of incriminating evidence linking Gen Sidwell and the elusive Victor Cassadine, who, despite official reports of his demise, appeared to still be wielding control from the shadows. Dalton had anticipated from the beginning that if Victor were still alive, he would use intermediaries like Sidwell to obscure his involvement. In response, the professor began inserting deliberately corrupted DNA samples into the testing queue, subtle distortions that couldn't be detected by the untrained eye but, when cross-referenced with other data, created unmistakable red flags. He also drafted research reports embedded with misleading conclusions, carefully phrased in a way that would misinform and agitate Sidwell, prompting rash decisions and additional contact from his mysterious superior. Every misstep on Dalton's part was a provocation, designed to draw out the hidden hand. But his most significant breakthrough came when he successfully infiltrated the encrypted security network Sidwell had been using to communicate with his unknown employer. What Dalton uncovered shocked even him. Among a cluster of seemingly routine pings and routing signals, he identified an irregular data stream originating from a device that didn't belong to any registered mobile or satellite communication network. Tracing its source led him to the frigid waters off the coast of Iceland, precisely where Victor Cassadine's yacht had last broadcast a distress signal before his presumed death. The implications were staggering. This device, still active, still transmitting, couldn't belong to a dead man. Dalton realized he wasn't just dealing with legacy threats, he was facing an enemy who had faked his own death and resumed operations from a place no one would think to look. To capitalize on this discovery, Dalton created a shadow program capable of cloning every incoming and outgoing transmission from the network. This tool wasn't just collecting data. It was analyzing interaction patterns, time signatures, behavioral linguistics, and decision trees. Through this, Dalton aimed to build a psychological and operational profile of the organization threatening him. He wasn't content with merely surviving. He wanted to dismantle the structure brick by brick and expose its core to the world. In secret, he continued his work, masked by the illusion of disarray. While Port Charles was preoccupied with its public tragedies, deaths, betrayals, scandals, Dalton's laboratory became the nerve center of a quiet war. Among the sterile rows of beakers, encoded protein chains, and synthetic RNA samples, he was assembling what he believed would be the ultimate weapon of truth, a final genomic prototype. This prototype was more than a scientific feat, it was a key. A genetic sequence specifically engineered to recognize, isolate, and trace the unique biological markers of the Cassadine bloodline. Something that no alias, disguise, or surgical reconstruction could ever erase. If Victor had used cloning or genetic manipulation to mask his identity, Dalton's creation would reveal it. But Dalton's motives were not rooted in revenge or scientific glory. What he sought was revelation. He wanted to tear away the veil of lies, to expose the criminal syndicate that had turned him into an unwilling pawn, and to reveal the truth to Port Charles before it was too late. He knew the price of discovery could be deadly. Should Sidwell or Victor learn of his true intentions, there would be no negotiation, only elimination. But Dalton was no longer a cornered man. He was the orchestrator, the one moving pieces into place on a board no one else could see. He built backdoors into every system, embedded viruses into Sidwell's communication lines, and distributed segments of his findings across a network of trusted scientific colleagues who didn't even know they were part of a greater plan. Each was given access to encrypted data that, when compiled, would form the full picture, ensuring that even if Dalton fell, the truth would rise. He also created a failsafe. A digital dead man switch that would activate the instant he was silenced, releasing every classified document, audio transcript, and genetic analysis to both the media and law enforcement. Dalton understood that the Cassadine name carried with it a history of obsession, manipulation, and domination. But he also believed that no legacy, no matter how deeply rooted in myth or wealth, was immune to the light of truth. His mission was now existential. Science had become his battleground, data his weapon, and truth his final act of defiance. In the end, Dalton wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every victim silenced by the Cassadine web of power. He was fighting to bring an end to the manipulation that had festered in the shadows of Port Charles for generations. And should he succeed, history wouldn't remember him as the scientist who failed. It would remember him as the one who looked into the darkness, and chose to fight. Dalton understood better than anyone that he was navigating a path where the line between triumph and obliteration was paper-thin, where a single misstep could collapse the entire architecture of subterfuge he had spent years crafting. He was not merely contending with the pressure of scientific innovation under dangerous scrutiny. He was orchestrating a silent rebellion against forces so entrenched and so deeply embedded in global networks of influence that any overt action would be akin to suicide. This was not a fight waged in the streets or courts. This was a war of intelligence, timing, and invisible influence, where whispers could be more lethal than bullets, and silence often concealed the sharpest blades. Every day, Dalton walked a tightrope strung high above a void. To the outside world. His peers, investors, even those closest to him, he projected the image of a man defeated, consumed by the weight of a project too complex, too ambitious, too ill-fated to succeed. But that was the illusion. Beneath that facade was a mind constantly in motion, dissecting patterns, anticipating reactions, and building a web of contingency plans so dense that even failure had been accounted for. The pressure to deliver results, the threats from Sidwell, the suspicion of surveillance. None of it was unexpected. Dalton had assumed from the beginning that he was being watched. He just didn't know how many eyes were on him, or how far their reach extended. Victor Cassadine. The name hung like a shadow in every equation Dalton wrote, every sample he tested, every encrypted server he accessed in the dead of night. Dalton did not fear the man as much as he feared the ideology Victor represented. One that viewed human life as malleable clay to be sculpted for power, legacy, and control. Victor had been reported dead in a blaze of fire and twisted metal off the coast of Greenland, but Dalton had never believed the corpse paraded around was truly him. The Cassidines, and Victor in particular, had never played by the rules of mortality. They had always been several moves ahead, unburdened by law or conscience. And if Victor had indeed survived, he would not suffer betrayal. He would eradicate it. That knowledge kept Dalton awake during long nights as he monitored packet traffic, parsed data streams, and intercepted anonymous digital relays. He wasn't just collecting information, he was weaving it into a map of influence, a living construct of how Victor's unseen hand was manipulating not just the science, but the people, the funding, and the very institutions of Port Charles. Every name connected to Sidwell became a point of interest. Every grant with obscure origins, every subcontractor hired without background checks, every encrypted phone call redirected through servers in Eastern Europe, Dalton captured it all. Piece by piece, he was uncovering a network so vast and so interwoven with the infrastructure of power that it terrified him. And yet, it also steeled him. Because Dalton possessed something his enemies had long abandoned, a moral compass uncorrupted by greed, and a will hardened by isolation. He had nothing left to protect but the truth. That made him the most dangerous kind of adversary, one who had already accepted the worst outcome and was prepared to walk through it if it meant taking his enemies with him. He had lost colleagues. He had lost funding. He had lost his name in academic circles. But he had not lost his vision. He had not lost his drive to expose the truth about the Cassidines, about Sidwell, about the future they were trying to manufacture in the dark. He knew the risk. If Victor learned of his duplicity, there would be no confrontation, no theatrical showdown. Victor's retribution would come silently, perhaps through a staged accident, a lab explosion, a sudden illness manufactured through a tailor-made virus engineered using the very tools Dalton had developed. And if Sidwell grew suspicious, Dalton might simply vanish. Disappeared under the guise of a mental breakdown or a tragic suicide, with forged letters and statements planted to cover every trace of dissent. These possibilities haunted him, but they didn't deter him. They pushed him harder. Dalton had installed redundancies in everything he touched. Every report sent to Sidwell had a shadow version, one that contradicted the data but was cloaked behind layers of misdirection, waiting to be discovered. Every security feed in his lab was copied and mirrored to a secure satellite node operated through a third-party science foundation that unknowingly housed the last backup of his life's work. He embedded warning signals into Sidwell's own communications hub, so that any deviation from expected behavior, an unusual travel route, a change in encryption signature, a deviation in digital tempo, would trigger an alert. He created false flags, fake errors, even synthetic personnel files to give the illusion of chaos while quietly streamlining his access to every corner of the digital empire he was poised to expose. And amid all of this, he continued work on his greatest achievement, a genetically reactive biometric marker that could identify the unique traits found only in the Cassidine bloodline, regardless of cloning, facial reconstruction, or synthetic tissue grafting. It was the final weapon. If Victor had altered himself, or created duplicates, this genomic tracer would find the original strand. It was not just a tool for identification. It was a key to unraveling whatever Victor had done to cheat death, to defy biology, and to mask his reappearance under layers of science and deceit. Dalton did not expect to win a public victory. He knew his fate might be sealed long before the truth ever reached the headlines. But he wasn't working for headlines. He was working for history. For justice. For the silence to finally break. All he needed was one crack. One lapse in Victor's iron discipline. One digital echo from Sidwell that revealed a trace of fear, or guilt, or desperation. One whistleblower in the organization who decided they could no longer live under the weight of their complicity. And when that moment came, When the house of cards began to tremble, Dalton would be ready. He would light the match. He would press send. He would activate every failsafe, every trigger, every chain of revelations. It would be swift. Relentless. Unstoppable. And even if he fell in the aftermath, even if his body was discarded in some back alley or beneath the rubble of a manufactured explosion, the truth would remain. Carved into data. Preserved in code. Etched in DNA. In that truth, he would live on. Not as a man who bowed to fear, but as the scientist who stared down a dynasty of manipulation, and chose to fight.